Now it's my great pleasure to welcome back for another year of ministry together, Reverend Paul Johnson, and he's going to speak to us on the Conundrum of Conscience.
The serpent was coiled up in the garden. The spade-shaped head turned, and he said to Eve, "Eve, eat the fruit of that tree." She replied, "No, we'll die." "No, you won't die," he said. "You will know the difference between good and evil. Your mind's eye will be open and you'll be like gods." So she looked at that fruit. It looked mighty good, and she took it and ate it, and her eye was opened. And now she wanted her companion to be equal to her, different from the dull-witted creatures in the garden. And so she gave him the apple, and he ate as well. Actually, we don't know if it was an apple. It just says the fruit of the tree. And his eye was opened as well. They couldn't remain in the garden anymore, for now the dull animal dream was over. Consciousness was bright and sharp, and there was work to be done and pain to be suffered and endured and life to be lived. The dream life of the garden was over, and they couldn't go back again. This is the legend I grew up with. How many of you grew up with that legend? It's been a very powerful one in Western culture. It has to do with the dawn of human awareness, of the awakening of human sense of self. And one of its many meanings is that we experience ourselves as moral agents who make decisions on the basis of conscience of good and evil, or good and lesser evil, of course. We come to this decision-making with one or both elements that you'll find in discussions of conscience. One, I call conscience from below. It's kind of a gut feeling. I will feel guilty if I do this, or I will feel guilty if I don't do this, or I will feel good if I do this. And the other is a conscience from above. This makes sense if I do this. This is reasonable according to my accepted moral principles. These two things are involved in any definition of conscience that I've found. And it's been very important to Unitarian Universalists. I could name people from both our Unitarian and Universalist traditions that made conscience a very important part of their religious understandings. I've titled my sermon this morning, "The Conundrum of Conscience," because I suggest that it presents us with a riddle or something that puzzles. Where does it come from? What is its basis? Can it always be relied upon? So in dealing with this conundrum, I'll take you on a very quick historical pilgrimage across Western culture, and then I'll highlight some of the challenges to these traditions of Western culture regarding conscience. But we'll start out with the Greeks. And in Greek, conscience means to hug a secret to oneself, or to be a witness for or against oneself. And its usage, particularly in the tragic playwrights, suggests that conscience is connected with a fixed moral order of things. And when we act contrary to that, we feel a sense of guilt. But when you get into the Romans, such as Cicero and the later Stoics, you don't have a sense necessarily of guilt. You have a sense of rationality. I will feel good or ill regarding a projective course of action because it does not make sense according to moral principles which I have believed obtain in this situation without any reference to guilt, shame, or fear. And then a very interesting Christian conception comes in with St. Paul, who of course was a Jew and believed in the authoritative conscience coming out of the Mosaic law, but he added a wrinkle because his ministry was to the Gentiles. He said Gentiles who don't have the Mosaic law may exhibit the effect of that law written upon their hearts, that there's something inherent in every human being that has the basics of the Mosaic law, and their conscience either accuses or defends them in terms of it. But he said it can be an error, this Gentile conscience. And he uses as an example those timid and, he thought, narrow Christians who were afraid of buying meat in the market because it might have been offered to idols. And so they weren't going to eat any of that meat coming from the market. He said, well, there's not really these other gods. You don't have to worry about that. But you should still follow your conscience, because the unity of moral personality is more important than violating your conscience. So that's an interesting wrinkle on conscience. Thomas Aquinas, of course, the primary architect of medieval Roman Catholicism, had a very high view of conscience from above, or reason, suggesting that the moral law is written on the hearts of every human being and should be followed. Martin Luther had kind of a different position. He felt his conscience should be captive to what his interpretations of the Bible, and to go against your conscience is neither right nor honorable. It might sound like conscience from below, but really was conscience from above. It was his reasonable interpretation of Scripture. Then we go to the next step, and that's the radical Reformation, represented by George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, who believed that God speaks directly to people through conscience. This was ideally to bring unconditional honesty, righteousness, and pacifism. This is subjective conscience from below, and had a real resonance with the transcendentalists of our Unitarian movement, such as Theodore Parker and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Margaret Fuller. Immanuel Kant, the influential 19th century German philosopher, said that conscience was the seat of his categorical imperative, which he believed to be the direct voice of God in the human soul. So up through the 19th century, conscience had an authoritative basis either in direct call of God to inner emotional awareness, or through the exercise of human reason, being directed to Scripture or to the natural moral law. But then Sigmund Freud came along and had a challenge to this. Said Freud, the philosopher Kant once declared that nothing proved the existence and greatness of God more than convincingly than the starry heavens and the moral conscience within us. The stars are unquestionably superb, but when it comes to conscience, God has been guilty of an uneven and careless piece of work. Freud, of course, thought conscience to be the superego element of the personality. Its origin is in the demands placed upon a child by parents or other adults, which the child then internalizes. What begins as a wholly parental voice becomes a wholly personal one, and fear of not being loved or of guilt becomes a guiding force in a child's life. So it's really, conscience is the voice of one particular set of parents or adults at a particular time and place, and is good, bad, or indifferent accordingly. And the relativism brought by Freud to the area of conscience below has come to conscience above, as well as philosophers, comparative anthropologists, and biblical critics have robbed us of a conception of natural law or authoritative Scripture upon which Cicero, St. Paul, Aquinas, or Luther may have based their arguments. So where does this place conscience in our day? Of course, today, all conscience, claims of conscience may have kind of a relativistic air about them. You know, you talk in time of peace, everyone believes war is a great evil, but comes war, there are some who say they're against it because of their conscience, and others support it because of their conscience. And in the recent Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court, you know, those in favor of that decision say they do so out of conscience. Those against it say they do so out of conscience. And we also must realize that following conscience can lead to desperately evil acts. take John Brown of Harper's Ferry fame, who was a hero to a lot of Unitarians of his age, not all of them. But you know what he did in Kansas? He killed 5 people in cold blood. And in justifying himself, he said, God has used me as an instrument to kill men. And if I live, I think he will use me as an instrument to kill many more. Pascal shrewdly observed, men never do evil so fully and happily as when they do it for conscience sake. And we can see that through history with all the crucifixions and stonings and burnings at the stake and so forth. So all of this brings us to the central conundrum of conscience. If it's not the highly unreliable superego of conscience from below, or the questionable questionings of scripture and natural moral law, what is the basis for conscience in our world today? Does it have any basis? Well, I think its basis is gets its basis when we ask ourselves what kind of lives we want to live. Do we want careless, reckless lives? Do we want steady, poised, able lives? Do we want ruthless taking lives? Do we want generous, considerate, hopeful lives, both for ourselves and for young people that we're responsible for? And the answer lies in our deepest selves and in our most honest communication with ourselves in the whole scene of human experience. Conscience is the value structure, and to be without that is to be at sea, unpredictable to oneself on how we will meet the next person or the next day. No, actually, in fact, I did my doctoral thesis on this, that our Unitarian forebears did not give a carte blanche, so many of them, to conscience. They spoke out for educated conscience, that conscience is a quality, human quality, that must be educated. So the first thing I think they called for was to put our reason to work and question the part of our conscience which we've inherited from our parents or from others. Do they meet the test of adequate and reasonable demands upon us? Now, my parents were very, very active super ego types. We had daily Bible readings and questions about moral dilemmas around the table. And my mother, I think, was the most moral person I ever met. I remember one time we were selling a piano that we no longer wanted, an old upright. And someone came to buy it. And he said, how much do you want for it? And he said, well, I'll give you 25. She says, I think that's too much. You can have it for 15. She just didn't want to take advantage dishonestly of anyone. And so, and that always stands out to me of my mother. But of course, the 10 Commandments were regularly preached, and I think they're a good guidance and have served me well in terms of lying and stealing and adultery and even keeping the Sabbath. Sundays are tough for ministers in the Christian tradition, as you grew up into, and even in the Unitarian tradition. But I would keep Mondays over the years as a day away from work, a day of restoration to the best degree I could, unless an emergency came up. So much of what they taught me of my inherited conscience makes sense, but some didn't. No dancing. By God, do I ever enjoy dancing now? Don't go to any movies. Boy, when I got out of home to college, I remember going to my first movie, The Great Estate, with Steve McQueen. It was one of the greatest experiences of my life. And eventually I had no guilty conscience over going to the movies. My mother was so, she thought any gambling, of course, was terrible. We couldn't even play cards, whatever. My brother learned how to play poker out of the encyclopedia, and we played it up in the attic until my dad found us doing it and confiscated the cards and said, "Don't you ever do that again." But I never got into gambling, except when Slots of Fun out in front of Circus in Las Vegas had 50-cent bets. And I went wild on even base bets on, on the shaking of the dice. And I thought I think over time, I gained about $2 from that. But I learned, boy, I tell you, this could be a dangerous road for me. And my mother was right. She even thought, of course, the stock market was a gamble. And when I bought my first stock, I felt a little guilty, but it's turned out pretty well. I think my mother, in fact, she even did well in the stock market eventually. Not by her own doing, but an advisor said, "I think you ought to put this money, some of the money she inherited from my dad, in the stock." And I said, "Mom, you shouldn't be wasting it." But it grew immensely. And of course, I benefited from that when she left us. But anyway, so some aspects was very, very important from the conscience I grew up in, and some I've challenged. But we all should challenge authority. And, I was just going to do an abbreviated example of the greatest example of this, but I'm going to take the time this morning to tell you about this. I learned about this first, I believe, in graduate school. The Stanley Milgram studies on conscience from the 1960s. Any of you acquainted with those studies? But just to remind you, the experiment consisted of a teacher and a learner who ostensibly are to take part in an exercise on memory and learning. The learner is strapped into sort of a miniature electric chair and given a long list of word pairs to memorize, and then told he will be tested on his ability to remember the second word of the pair when he hears the first one. Whenever he makes an error, he is to receive an electric shock to be administered by the teacher, who is out of sight of the learner. Behind an instrument panel that the teacher sits, that's labeled with voltage designations ranging from 15 to 450 volts. The teacher is then given a simple 45-volt shock before the experiment begins to strengthen the belief in the authenticity of the machine. And then the experiment begins. Actually, the learner is an accomplice who receives no shock at all. The point of the experiment is to see how far the teacher will proceed in a concrete situation in which he is ordered to inflict increasing pain on a protesting victim. At 75 volts, the learner grunts. At 120 volts, he complains loudly. And at 150 volts, he demands to be released from the experiment, claiming that he has heart trouble and may have a heart attack. As the voltage increases, his protests become more vehement and emotional. At 285 volts, his response becomes an agonizing scream. And this becomes a real test of conscience for the teacher. And the suffering is very evident, but each time he hesitates, the experimenter said, "This is very important for scientific progress. You must go on." And that 60% of all subjects went all the way to 450 volts. Can you imagine that? Now, the subjects were all men between the ages of 20 and 50 from many different professions and backgrounds and socioeconomic statuses. I sometimes wonder, would it have been different if women had been in there? I don't know. I think it might have been. And maybe older than 50, maybe that would have made a difference. But it wasn't out of a sense of sadism, because when they were left to choose their own voltage, very few went above 60 degrees, 60 volts. That's it for me. So the fundamental lesson of this experiment, which has been replicated a number of other times, has suggested that people become agents in a terribly destructive process whenever they're challenged by authority. And I thought of this so much during the January 6th hearings. Several of the people that I've heard mention the experience who were part of being in the insurrection said that I think they did it out of good conscience. They accepted the authority of President Trump, and they believed that they were acting in the right way to save our democracy. I remember one person in particular who said, well, the president was there and he told us to go up there and he was going to go up there with us. And I thought I was doing my patriotic duty. And when he said that, I said, well, didn't he realize that, our Attorney General Barr said that there was no corruption that would have changed the thing? How many recounts there had been? 62 cases brought up, which had been dismissed because of lack of evidence. Didn't that challenge him? Then I got to thinking, maybe he didn't have access to that all that information. Maybe he didn't watch MSNBC. He probably didn't. But it's important that all of us question authority. I remember a number of years ago, I was with a number of religious liberals from many religious traditions on a pilgrimage to Japan. And at one point, we were at Tsubaki Grand Shrine, the Shinto shrine. And we were invited to take part in their most sacred ritual called the water ritual. And which involved late at night, I think it was close to midnight, standing under a stream coming out of the mountain up on a rock by a river. And these Shinto prayers would be said over you. And this was supposed to cleanse you from all sin. And I had such misgivings about doing that. First of all, the men had to wear very skimpy loincloths. I'd never had a loincloth on before. I was a little unhappy about that. The women could wear these nice white robes, but the men had to wear these loincloths. And when I thought to myself, well, that's not really what's bothering me. Is it that I'm just getting cheap grace by going through this ceremony, which I don't really understand? And so is it cultural appropriation? And I said, well, they very graciously invited us and wanted us to take part. That's not it. And what it really was my mother's voice and my father's voice. This is obedience to an alien God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And I said, well, I am going to challenge that. And I went and I did it. It wasn't comfortable. That was pretty cold water. But I'm glad I did it as a sign of solidarity with these fellow liberal religionists. But there's a problem with rationality at times, isn't it? Because as Franklin once said, it's man's happiest faculty, for he can talk himself into anything. We can rationalize ourselves into anything, right? Remember that old song from Billy Joel? Go ahead and hate your neighbor. Go ahead and cheat your friend. You can do it in the name of heaven. You can justify it in the end. But when our conscience is pricked on conscience from below, it's important for us to pay heed to see if that makes sense and is important to us, and not just to shrug it off. I many years ago, I came across this poem by Robinson Jeffers. I don't know if you know Robinson Jeffers, the famous poet. I think he died way back in 1962. While researching this last week, I found out he was a son of a Presbyterian minister, and who was also a biblical scholar. And so I'm sure he had a strong conscience growing up. But I'm going to read a portion of his poem, Advice to Pilgrims. That our senses lie and our minds trick us is true, but in general, they are honest rustics. Trust them a little. The senses, more than the man, and our own mind more than another man's. As to the mind's pilot, intuition, what I would say is similar to conscience. As to the mind's pilot, intuition, catch him clean and stark naked, he is the first of truth tellers. Dream clothed or dirty with fears and wishes, he is the prince of liars. Isn't that an interesting insight? If we can catch our intuition stark naked, untrammeled by fears and wishes, that's about the best we can do, isn't it, in decision making? So what I've outlined this morning is that we should all make conscience our own project, an ongoing project through our whole lives. I like what John Wesley, a founder of Methodism, said. He said, when you're making a moral decision, you should consult the scriptures, consult the tradition of the church, use the power of reason, and examine one's life's experience. I would add one more to John Wesley. John, we're here today, I'd suggest this to him. Add to that the experience of others. And of course, that's what we're doing in the Wisdom Circle, which I just started yesterday, and we're going to continue every Saturday morning when I'm here, where in reference to moral choices, we learn about other people, and that adds to our own store of wisdom. In terms of scriptures, our UU tradition is open not only to the Bible from the Jewish and Christian traditions, but from all the world's religions, if there's something we found. Not that they're inerrant, they include errors and maybe contradictions and prejudices at times and maybe mixed messages, but there are nuggets of wisdom and tradition there that can help us a good deal. And I hope that we will be a center of conscience as a community to help us with reason. And you're not going to find too many other traditions, maybe than that one suggested by Methodism, but I don't think it's in there are formal doctrines that honor reason, a firm and a disciplined search for truth. Reason is the capacity for curiosity and observation and comprehension and logical inference that is part of our natural endowment. And so hopefully, and here to show that I'm open to all traditions, I've already done this with Wesley, but I just love what Wesley says is the goal of conscience. It's to do all the good you can by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. Good conscience and developing conscience and educating conscience to all of you. So may it be.